Hi, I'm Dave Clark. My wife Sherry and I love to travel. I just finished a project to scan the slides for our first trip to Africa in 1988. Looking at these pictures brought back a flood of memories from that trip and subsequent trips to Africa. Our 1988 trip was to Kenya and Tanzania. Since then, we've been back to Africa 11 times. We've been to 23 countries, some several times. Needless to say, Africa is our favorite continent. We love the people of Africa, and the landscapes, and most of all the animals, but also sundowners at the end of the day. We visited the urban centers, taken in the art and music scenes in Dakar, Senegal, the Paris of Africa. We've enjoyed the cosmopolitan pleasures of Cape Town, with its delicious food and drink in the wine country. We've trekked to gorillas in Uganda and Rwanda. Sadly, some places we've been to are now in civil war. The priceless manuscripts of Timbuktu are at risk. The endangered and rare wildlife of Ethiopia is not being protected during the civil strife there. Since 1988, we've been back to Tanzania 3 times, but to Kenya only once in 2018, 30 years after our first visit. I still remember that we had some strong reactions in 1988 that caused us to explore other parts of Africa for those 30 years. Back then, Kenya was ruled by a repressive authoritarian regime. The end of the Cold War marked a decline in foreign aid. Vehicles were prone to breakdown. Upgrades to roads and lodges were difficult due to widespread corruption. But the people and the landscapes were wonderful. And the wildlife was magnificent. Sherry suggested that it would be a good idea to make a video comparing our experiences in 1988 with those 30 years later in 2018. What's changed, for the better or worse? And what's unchanged? So that's what I'll try to do, starting with our first stop in both trips to Kenya, Nairobi. Nairobi is the capital and largest city in Kenya. It's a colonial town built at the end of the railroad tracks in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1988, the population of Nairobi was 1.3 million. When we visited in 2018, the population had grown to 4.4 million. The UN forecasts that in 10 years, there will be 8.5 million people living in Nairobi. In 1988, Nairobi was a bustling city, but we had no problems walking around. Our guide proudly took us on a city tour, including the train station and the Railroad Museum, the Kenyatta Convention Center, and Uhuru Park for a view of the Nairobi skyline. In 2018, Nairobi traffic was terrible, as you could expect from the population growth. Our guide hustled us out of town as quickly as possible. On both trips to Kenya, we started with a night at the historic Norfolk Hotel, which opened in 1904. I remember a slightly funky hotel with historical photos lining the walls. There were atriums in the courtyard to introduce us to the birds of Kenya. By 2018, the birds were gone, and the hotel had been upgraded to accommodate the well-heeled traveler. Gone too was the welcoming entrance, replaced by fortifications and security in response to the terrorist attacks in the city in 1998 at the U.S. Embassy and 2013 mall shooting. Bottom line is that Nairobi is not to our liking anymore. It's a necessary arrival point, but it's best to minimize your time in Nairobi. In 1988, we started our safari in the Aberdares, north of Nairobi. We stayed at Treetops, a rustic hotel built on stilts around a well-lit waterhole. We could watch the animals all night. Two lasting memories from that night. the white hunter with a large war rifle ordering around the hotel staff, and the plaque indicating that Princess Elizabeth was here when her father, King George VI, died and she became Queen Elizabeth II. At the equally historic Outspan Hotel, we were introduced to the Kikuyu. Our guide, John, explained matter-of-factly that the Kikuyu have dominated business and politics since independence. It makes it hard for other ethnic groups to get ahead, especially with the corruption that's widespread. Ethnic issues, corruption, and the disparity in wealth distribution were the major reasons it took us 30 years to visit Kenya once again. And I'm here to report that these issues have only gotten worse, driven by pressure from population growth and climate change. But it's not all gloom and doom. In 2018, we stayed at the Liwa Wildlife Conservancy, a public-private partnership focused on the protection and management of endangered species, especially the rhino and Grebbe's zebra. Beginning as a cattle ranch in 1922, Liwa's owners respected the wildlife on their land and developed an ecotourism business on the side. By 1986, the black rhino population in Kenya had declined from 20,000 to about 200 due to poaching. The owners of Liwa were approached to create a safe place for the rhino. Part of the ranch was fenced and poaching patrols began. But most importantly, the surrounding communities were engaged. Money from tourism, grants, and donations were used to engage the local people in education, anti-poaching and security, and wildlife conservation and research. Over the years, the outreach has expanded to women's micro-enterprises, healthcare, water access, and training in sustainable agriculture. The result is a magical place where visitors can enjoy sights and sounds of Africa, knowing that the community is directly benefiting from their spending. The comparison with government-run parks such as Masai Mara is striking. The situation there is much the same as it was in 1988. The Maasai communities have been evicted from their ancestral lands and live on the margins of the parks, with no direct benefit from the tourist dollars. Park rangers openly solicit money and extra lunches from the guides. Today, there are over 30 conservancies in Kenya that offer an alternative that benefits the local communities, the wildlife, and the visitor. And now on to Tanzania. The Ngorongoro Crater and the Serengeti are two of the most spectacular landscapes in Africa, which is why we keep coming back to Tanzania in spite of its issues. In 1988, going through customs at Kilimanjaro Airport cost me a roll of my precious film. Tanzania's government had adopted African socialism and had strong links to China and Russia. Corruption, excessive taxation, and waste of public funds were rampant. The Ngorongoro Crater Lodge was perched on the rim of the crater. The rooms were Spartan. The plumbing worked most of the time, but every room had a great view of the crater. When we returned to Ngorongoro in 2017, the lodge had been completely torn down. It had been replaced by a high-end lodge. The tour could only be described as African Victorian, and the cabins were very quirky. The view of the crater remained outstanding. In 1988, the crater's isolated lion population had been suffering from 20 years of inbreeding. On our visit in 2017, the lion population seems to have rebounded thanks to several outside males bringing new genes into the population. Ngorongoro is a very special place and needs to be on everybody's bucket list. In the Serengeti in 1988, we stayed at Serenera Lodge. It's unique in that it's built on a copy, one of those enigmatic piles of rock randomly deposited in the Serengeti Plain. You share the copy with rock hyraxes and baboons. In 1988, it was suffering from neglect. The swimming pool had developed a crack and was empty. Water was only available in the afternoon. In the ensuing years, outside investment has repaired the pool and refurbished the lodge to make it one of the most unique in East Africa. On the endless plains of the Serengeti, life goes on as it has for thousands of years. The yearly cycle of rain, growth, and migration drive the circle of life. Serengeti is well worth the trip. But unfortunately, Tanzania's government has not done so well of late. Since 2015, there's been a marked decline in free and fair elections and the freedom of expression, association, and assembly. So Africa, then and now. Sherry and I are older and maybe wiser. Travel in Africa is easier now than it was 35 years ago, but it is also more crowded. Tourist infrastructure, including lodges and airstrips, have definitely been improved. NGOs focused on conservation and conservancies are greatly improving the life of wildlife through anti-poaching patrols and research. Conservancies have the promise of improving human life, while at the same time conserving wildlife and wild places. Africa needs our help. Its people, their way of life, and Africa's unique wildlife are at risk from population growth and climate change. If you haven't been to Africa, go soon. If you have, go again and seek out conservancies for an outstanding safari. Meanwhile, make donations to organizations that support Africa, its people, and its wildlife. Here's two of our favorites. Thanks for watching. Please leave your comments and questions, and be sure to subscribe to my channel to follow our adventures around the world.